Because I was a dorm chief in basic training, by the time I got to my very first assignment, which was just a training base in the little tiny town of Chanute, Illinois, at, well, it was actually Chanute Air Base at Champaign, Illinois. And it was a training base for a lot of different people. So 90% of the people on this base who were not instructors or admin were trainees, meaning fresh out of basic training, young in the military career, young in their life, a little bit rambunctious, still doing the things that were not necessarily conducive to military life, but they were on their way. It was their first year, if you will, because basic training for the Air Force is 30 days, unless you really mess something up and you get what they call recycled and you have to start all over again. So by the time I got to this first base, I was 20 years old. It was coming up on my 21st birthday. I had already been a dorm chief. I had already been out in the working world for a year or so. And so I was a couple of steps ahead of many of the people that I went to basic training with, and even many of the people that I went to my first duty assignment with to train as a firefighter. So they have a program called the Ropes Course. And it's basically a leadership course. You wear a rope around your shoulder to let people know that you're a leader in training. And I think I was there all of about a week and a half before I got into an argument with one of the gentlemen who was a sergeant. He was an E4, I believe, and I was an E0, an Airman Basic. And the conversation had something to do with he wanted a particular thing to happen, and I believe it was marching the trainees in the dark on a snowy, icy day from the barracks to the chow hall. And he had asked me to lead them, and I said, oh, I'm okay leading them, but if we wait 10 minutes, we'll still be in the same line at the chow hall, but it won't be dark where someone can get hurt on the ice. And that was not an adequate answer for him. My idea of something different than what he told me to do was not sufficient. In the real world, you might call that insubordination. And in the military world, insubordination is a pretty significant offense. The idea that you were told to do something is the end of the conversation, especially if the someone telling you to do something is of higher rank or has authority over you. Now, in the military, there's a rank structure that has nothing to do with your immediate chain of command. And so you have both a chain of command and a rank structure. Let me explain what I mean by that. The rank structure says because you have XYZ amount of time in service and time in grade and time on the job, then you're going to grow from an airman basic to an airman first class to a senior airman to a sergeant, et cetera, et cetera. And as you progress up that scale, your level of authority, your level of responsibility, your level of the number of people to whom you can say do this and they must do this, regardless of whether they work for you on a daily basis or not, continues to grow. Now, for those who come into the military services with an education already and come in as an officer, it's a regular thing to see someone who's been an enlisted person for 6, 8, 10 years, who's reached the status of staff sergeant or technical sergeant, an E5 or an E6 or maybe even higher, who has a new boss who's fresh out of college and has their lieutenant's bars. Regardless of the amount of time that you have in service, the officer, the lieutenant, the commissioned officer, has more authority than the non-commissioned officer. And there are many, many occasions where a senior master sergeant or a chief master sergeant has someone in their chain of command they have to report to who in the structural command, meaning their rank position, has more authority than they do. And it becomes a real challenge. But the reality is, in all of those situations, there's an appointed authority. And I, as a young 20-something, didn't get that. I didn't like that. I didn't like the idea that it was just not logical to march 45 people in the dark on an icy sidewalk. I'm from Texas. Walking on the ice is a precarious idea to begin with. But to do it in the dark with 45 people, that just doesn't make any sense. Or wait 15 minutes so you can at least see where you're stepping is perfectly logical to me. And that kind of thought process doesn't really fit in an authoritative type of relationship. Here's one of the things that I never asked. Why would he want us to march on the ice in the dark? I never asked that question. But nor did I have the right to ask that question because he was in authority over me. The result was I took my rope off and handed it back to him, and he didn't ask for it. He didn't tell me that I had to quit. I just told him, if leadership looks like you do what you're told even when it makes no sense, you do what you're told even when you put yourself in harm's way, you do what you're told even when you put others in harm's way, then I got no inclination to be in leadership like that because it just doesn't make sense. I said, I believe there are people who are born leaders who have natural instincts and natural influence, and people tend to follow them regardless of what their rank is. And I believe I'm that kind of leader. And he said, well, in this man's military, you're the leader that you're allowed to be based on the rank that you've earned, and you haven't earned any, and you need to do what you're told. So after that conversation, I took my rope off and I handed it back to him and said, I don't think I want to be a leader like that. And I stepped out of the role as a leader and went on my merry way with a lot less responsibility and a lot less authority, and I didn't have to do those kinds of things. Now, I can look back, almost 30 years now to that time frame, and I can see a couple of things that I couldn't see then. A couple of things that if my boys were coming up on an encounter like that and I had a chance to advise them and I had a chance to give them insights, here's a couple of little factors that I noticed going on around me. Number one, I was in a particular dorm on that base, and my roommate wasn't even someone else who was in the fire department. In fact, there were a lot of people in the dorm that I was in that were not in the same training field that I was in. They had one other thing in common, though. They all had ropes. What that tells me as I look back on it, and I didn't even recognize it then, and no one said anything about it, no one brought it up, was that dorm was a compilation of people from various fields of discipline who were all recognized as potential leaders for the future. People that were going to be groomed into a leadership role. Now, they didn't take me out of that dorm when I surrendered my rope and I gave it up. But I did see different relationships and cliques, if you will, and command structure begin to take place at that particular base in that particular dorm. And it's really kind of ironic when I look back now how we say as leadership coaches, and I am a leadership coach now, I look back on that day and I say, well, there's a good reason to put them all together because you become like the 5 people you hang out with. You'll learn the same kinds of conversations. You'll learn what's important and what's not. You understand what it's like to give orders and have them not obeyed. You understand how that process works and what should you do about it because you're around other people who have the same expectations. See, it's taken me many, many years to come to that conclusion, to come to that awareness, because it wasn't something that I was raised with necessarily. But it is something that's very important in our lives. As leaders, though, there's one other thing that we have to remember. Regardless of the level that we're at as leaders, regardless of the education level, regardless of the position in the job, regardless of the size of our bank account, regardless of how many years we've been on the job, there will always be someone, one level of authority above us. And that one someone or that group of someones that have that level of authority above us, think even to a large major organization where you have a CEO and a president and a CFO and a COO in this giant company. And you would think, well, as the CEO, he can do whatever he wants to. Well, to a large degree, yes. But even a CEO has to answer to the board. And if they don't have a board, but they're a publicly traded company, the CEO has to answer to the stockholders. So there's always, at every level, regardless who you are, there's always someone to answer to. There's always someone that has authority over you. So I've been reading, and I've got literally one chapter left. You can see I'm just nearly done with Divine Detours by Dr. Sion Alfred. The thing that I stumbled across yesterday is what brings me to this message today. Because it's something that I'm beginning to understand without really having been able to put my finger on it exactly. A few weeks back, you might remember I talked about the glass ceiling and how I felt like there was a time in my life, 20 plus years ago, that I had revelations of what my life would be, of what the future would be. And there was a list of things that were part of my dream, part of my vision, part of what has caused me to push forward in my life. And those things, those revelations, were beyond a glass ceiling. And in the revelation, in the prophecy, in the prayer time, I felt like God said, do you see the glass ceiling? If you break it, everything on the other side disappears. It just vanishes. It goes away like a vapor. But if you find the key and you unlock it, in unlocking it, in opening that door properly, moving into those things, you'll find yourself where all your gifts and talents have been put into play exactly the way they were supposed to be. And I thought I was beginning to understand what that meant. I finally got the clue that key was humility. And I finally understood that I've got to apply humility to everything in order to succeed at anything. And I thought I was well on my way until I read this passage yesterday. It's the scary thing about humility, that just when you think you figured out humility, it's pride telling you that. So I'm reading through this passage yesterday, and he says, you take that thing you're considering and submit it to your authority and your peers for checks and balances. You explain your idea to those who report to you and encourage their honest feedback. But don't pull the God card. Always leave the door open for authority to speak the Lord's wisdom into the situation. Then he goes on to say, I think God let me do that to teach me a lesson. He wanted me to go into the office and submit my beloved idea to the pastor. He wanted me to remain open and honest, to remain open to honest feedback that would have been true submission. Prideful people love to criticize their boss. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls as those who have to give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with groaning, for that would be of no advantage to you. That's Hebrews 13:7. How many times do we find ourselves not obeying and submitting? He goes on to say, God didn't say obey your leaders if you agree with them. No, God says obey and submit, not simply to obey, not merely to submit, but to both obey and submit. Obedience deals with your actions, while submission deals with your attitude. In the case of my grand plan, I ended up obeying my pastor, but I wasn't submitted. My attitude was, well, I guess he can't hear from God like I can. He doesn't know. He'll find out the hard way. And then I stumbled onto this piece right here. If you have kids, you know what it means, especially if they're teenagers. When I tell one of my kids, go clean up your room, they turn to obey, but sometimes I sense them rolling their eyes. They may have obeyed, but their little hearts didn't honor their father. There was no submission. Long ago, my wife and I realized God wasn't calling us to discipline our children's, God was calling us to discipline our children's attitudes and not just their actions, because God has instructed all of us to submit to authority and not just obey it. Submission to authority is an important subject. I believe the greater the calling, the higher the platform of influence, the greater the gifting, the more submission needs to have its place in our lives. Submission is proof of humility, and it's the great protector of humility. You will never get to a place in life where you don't need true submission. Pastor Thomas Miller of Gateway says, you can't truly walk in authority until you're submitted to authority. When God promotes you to a position in his kingdom, it is always a place of authority. He doesn't, however, promote you to a place that you no longer require submission. No one is to live without the covering of authority. We are all called to submit ourselves to one another. Submit to one another for the reverence of Christ. That's Ephesians 5:21. But Zion, I submit my authority and they just don't understand me and they're holding me back and for my calling. And Zion says, let me comfort you. There's no authority that God has not established, including the one you're talking about. Again, there's no authority except the one that God established. That's Romans 13, 1, 2. That's what's on the screen there. Then he goes on to say this. He said, the reason, as bad as it sounds, it's also comforting. The reason that you are placed under the authority in your life is because God knows where you will grow. I understand that's hard to accept, but it's true. Nearly every month I get a call from a worship pastor who feels like God is calling him or her to another church because the pastor and leadership of their church don't see their potential and the giftings in them. They've hit a ceiling and they want out, like when I surrendered my rope. But let me tell you what I tell them. God knows the perfect environment where your gift needs to be planted. He knows what you need. He has planted you there for one purpose, to change you. God never places you in a position where you can change those in authority over you. Listen to that single statement one more time. Because I think, and especially with our millennium group of young people, the sense of entitlement, the sense that I am always right, or at least I should always get my way. I don't know if you saw it or not last night, but there was a group of people gathered for a celebration. And off to the side, there was a room labeled Scream, so that they could go into that room and scream. I believe this was on one of the Tonight shows. So they could go into that room and scream when they didn't get their way. On college campuses today, we have timeout rooms where people can put themselves in timeout because the day's just not going the way they want it. So rather than submit and obey, they get to push out and they just get to eject themselves from the scenario until the scenario becomes what they want it to be again. Until they get their way, they just disengage. God never places you in a position so that you can change those in authority over you. He places you there to change you. You were not sent to a church to change the pastor. You're not sent to a business to change the boss. You're not sent to a school to change the teachers. And you are not in your marriage to change your spouse. You are where God has placed you because he wants to change you. That is the blessing of submission. We are all changed when we are submitted. God uses authorities in our life to reveal our own unholy motives. Submission is humbling, and submission is the key to fulfilling the call in your life. God uses divine detours to create Christ-likeness in all of us. I can look back now, these 20 years later, these 2+ decades, and say, I didn't submit. Even if I had obeyed and marched the people in the dark on the ice, my heart would not have been in submission. I was in rebellion. I wanted my own way. I had thought through it. My logic came to a conclusion, and I was convinced that he was wrong and I was right, and we needed to do it my way. In my marriage, in raising kids, in places that I've worked, in groups that I've been a part of, I can see that trend in my own life. And that's something that I'm going to have to change. And because I've reached the level that I've reached as a leadership coach, as an international speaker and trainer, traveling around the world, and just now coming to the revelation that there are things in my life that I still need to change, I believe that there are probably others who have reached a level of authority in their life, who have reached a level of influence in their life, who might still need to submit to authority above them. Not just to obey, not just to do it because you were told to, or do it because it's the right thing to do, but to submit, to truly surrender your heart, to do what the authority above you has asked you to do, has called you to do, even if, you ready? Even if it makes no sense. Even if you're looking at it going, that's a dangerous idea. Now, obviously, if it's immediately putting life in harm's way, you might want to question that. If what they're asking you to do is illegal or immoral, then you might want to question that and push back a little bit. But genuinely speaking, if God's got this, if we really believe that God is in control, if we really believe that whatever's going on around us, no matter how silly or ridiculous the commands of our leaders are, that we follow them because ultimately they will answer to God, then now we must answer to God by submitting and obeying. I can also tell you one other thing that I've learned about my journey as a leader, and that is that people of influence have a continuous growth in their field of influence, in their sphere of influence. so long as they are submitted, not only to their influence, but to the people that they influence. And as that sphere continues to grow, it does seem to meet itself out that when you have a leader above you who is an incompetent leader, they don't stay there long. The system of this world seems to figure them out and move them on. Now, there are those who hold on to their position by financial influence and power. There are those that hold on to their influence by tyranny. They're just tyrants, and that's what lets them stay in their position. There are those that hold on to their position because they've manipulated their way in like the tentacles of an octopus. If you want a fascinating video, just go sometime on YouTube and type in Python eats and just leave it at that. And watch how the python starts with something small like the arm and wraps himself around, and then he intentionally stretches his body out across the other arm until he's got his victim, whether it's a calf or a cow or a goat or a hippopotamus or a human, it doesn't matter. He stretches them out and then he squeezes the life out of them. Then he stretches them again and squeezes the life out and stretches them again and squeezes the life out. And life tends to be that way for us. The challenges, the problems that we face, first they stretch us out and then they squeeze the life out of us. And when God intervenes in the leadership in our lives, he's going to do the same thing to the leadership. He's going to stretch them as far as they will go. And when they realize that they will not submit anymore, then there will be a high price to pay for that. But our job isn't to exact that price. Our job is to submit and obey. And that's hard. But if humility is the key to the gifts and the talents that God's laid in front of us, if humility is the key to our forward vision, look at Joseph. If humility was the key, which it was, because in pride he told his brothers about his dream, in pride he told his family about his dreams, and that got him thrown into the pit, which then led to being a slave and then being in prison before he was able to serve in Pharaoh's house and save his country. But if he had not had submission to authority as his life progressed, I'm afraid he would still be a slave or still be in prison. That didn't mean he wasn't assertive. That didn't mean he wasn't powerful and in control of his own life. Being submissive is not about weakness. Being submissive is about being willing to surrender. And those are different things. Surrendering to those in authority over you because you trust that God has A, placed them there, and B, placed you under them, and C, is still in control of everything, is entirely different than giving up and being spineless. And I don't think God called us to be spineless, but I do know he called us to be submissive. So my challenge for you today is this. As you look at the relationships around you, there are probably those to whom you are a peer. There are those that you lead, and there are those that lead you, those who have authority over you. Are you submissive and obedient to those that are above you? If you want to shorten the time in the training cycle that you're in now, the test that God has you in now, if you want to alleviate the pain, if you will, of staying in that test for a long period of time, you can do that easiest by submitting and obeying now. Are you willing to submit and obey? Are you willing to not get your way or not let your feelings be the most important or not have your successes the primary objective? Those are questions that you have to answer for yourself. But I want to challenge you to ask that daily. When someone above you, when someone with authority over you asks you to do something or pushes you to lean in a certain direction, are you willing to submit and obey as long as it's not illegal or immoral or life-threatening? My name is J Loren Norris, and you've been watching Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day.